Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us live at this event from Technology Needs to Climate Action. Very welcome to everyone from wherever you are joining us. My name is Yusuni Uldada. I'm the Deputy Director for the Office of Climate Change, Biodiversity and Environment at FAO, based in Rome, and it's my great pleasure to moderate this session today. Let me just set the scene before I introduce our speakers and panelists. This year has been, as everyone knows, really a very particular year because of the pandemic and the disruption that it has caused to our plans to organize climate change events, particularly in the various subsidiary bodies, the regional climate weeks, and also COP26. That they have all been postponed to next year. But the UNFCCC Secretariat has done a great job in organizing these kinds of events, starting with June Momentum for Climate Change that held a wide range of events involving a wide range of organizations and actors involved in the climate action, and now also these climate change dialogues between November and December to keep the momentum going and to show that despite the pandemic, we have been taking actions in various aspects that are needed to help implement the Paris Agreement. And in terms of the implementation of the Paris Agreement, as you know, the national determined contributions, NDCs, are absolutely central to achieving that, as it is also technology, and particularly the technology needs assessments. And technology needs assessments have been an important tool in helping countries identify their needs and priorities in what they need in terms of technology support, and then to identify the actors that will support them in implementing the technology needs assessment and also the technology action plans. So this is the purpose of our event today, is to look at the implementation of TNAs and how support is provided to countries, and to identify or to discuss also the opportunity for enhancing this support to countries with regard to the implementation of TNAs. And this event will focus particularly on this pathway from the identification of technology need by developing countries to taking action on the ground. So the way we will have this event, we're going to have three main parts. So the first session is going to be about having presentations that would be provided on the findings of the synthesis report, in particular on technology needs of developing countries, and also we'll hear about some countries' success stories as well. And the second part, we'll have it in the form of a panel discussion, which will focus on how support to the implementation of technology action plans could be actually enhanced further. And at the last session, session 3, we're going to have question answers, and I would encourage you following us at this event to place your questions at the chat box that you have on the right-hand side of your screen. So we would love to hear from you, and I will look at your questions and be happy to ask them to our panelists. So please bear that in mind. We would like this session to be interactive, and we would like to hear from you on your questions or anything you would like to share with us on this particular aspect and area of technology needs assessment. So let us kick off with the first session. As I said, in this session, we're going to showcase some TNA success stories, and also you will hear about the findings of the synthesis report on technology needs. For this, I'm very pleased to introduce our first speaker, Vladimir Hackl, who's a program officer at the UNFCCC Secretariat based in Bonn. He will share with us the main findings of the synthesis report on technology needs of developing countries. So each of the three speakers today will have 10 minutes. So Vladimir, you have the floor for 10 minutes, please. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Dituni. And I suggest immediately to go for the first slide. Thank you. The Secretariat team completed in 2020 the fourth TNA Synthesis report on the technology needs. May we move the slide, please? Thank you. And that was identified by developing country parties in period between 2009 and 2017 as a part of the GEF funded global TNA project. This report provides an overview of climate technology needs of 53 developing country parties. And actually, it was not only country work, but it enjoyed the support of several expertise institutions, including UNEP DTU Partnership, Technology Executive Committee, and UNEP on the first place. Next slide, please. As a part of process, on the top of technologies and sectors identified in mitigation and adaptation, parties also identified barriers to the deployment and diffusion of climate technologies, and also a series of enablers to overcome these barriers. And you may see that later in my presentation more specifically. Also, parties focus a lot in their reports on technology, which more implementation. They include financial and capacity building requirement for each action. Again, you will see that later. Next slide, please. The report highlights that also TNA work is not a standalone work. It's a very long process under convention. It enjoys attention of parties and supporters since 1999. But it works very much closely and complements determined contribution and also national adaptation plans as the parallel processes which are running. And the idea is to present this report at the next SBI session with the parties to the convention, with a view to discuss next steps of the report, and including specifically facilitating implementation of the TNA results. Next slide, please. Now, what you see now is the basically very nice overview of prioritized sectors for mitigation, which were considered by parties as a need, dominating by energy supply and consumption, followed by agriculture, forestry, waste, and industry. Next slide. In parallel, parties also prioritize adaptation sectors, which also, of course, are taking or putting borders or targets to technologies later on. So very much needed was considered agriculture, forestry, and land use concerning adaptation, followed by water, and then infrastructure, climate conservation, human health, tourism, energy, and other. Next slide. Now you can see within the energy industry, which was the main sector in mitigation, you can see the technologies which were prioritized under that sector, which basically are renewable energy technologies, solar photovoltaic, hydroelectricity, biomass and biogas, wind turbines, lighting, fluorescent light bulbs, improved cook stoves, which also we may hear later throughout the day as a case study in some African countries, and combined heat and power in biomass. Next slide. We may take a look in agriculture sector, which technologies dominated by developing countries. So we are here having lead by sprinkler and drip irrigation, crop diversification technologies and new varieties of crops, drought-resistant crop varieties, conservation agriculture, land use planning, agroforestry, rainwater harvesting, defined as the major technologies. Next slide. Now, to implement these technologies on a market, it's still we're facing quite significant gap between the need and implementation as such, and countries look also at barriers preventing technology transfer or preventing technology development and deployment. So in the mitigation, countries identified economic and financial barrier, technical barrier, policy, legal and regulatory, market failure, imperfections, information and awareness on both supply and demand side, institutional and organizational capacity, human skills as the main barriers. Next slide. We can mirror this with adaptation barriers, and you can see the barriers are quite similar with adaptation, which is also determining the enablers, which are the tools and processes which countries need to overcome these barriers. So we may have a serious enablers and case by case, including various tax exception, financial incentives. We may have a new policy creation, regulations, look at the development of skills, look at the development of human capacity as an example of such enablers. Next slide, please. Here I'd like to focus on a more and more important step of the TNA process, which is technology action plans, which should be sort of like a precondition to express what countries would like to implement in future. So we have a TAP as a separate step, and countries, and I'll show you how it looks like actually, what it composed of. And they actually summarize enablers in technology action plans. It's a group of measures to address identified barriers to the development and transfer of technologies. And they were applied at a couple of levels throughout the countries, whether it's national, sectoral, or technology level. And you can see some examples in a bracket. Next slide. Now, if you look, we have quite a lot of individual technology action plans. If you think about 53 countries, we have 640 individual TAPs, making it more than 10 per country. And a little bit more we have seen in adaptation technologies, followed by mitigation, submitted almost by every party which work on the report. 90% of parties submitted TAP for adaptation, 89 countries for mitigation, and also we can see measures categorized, looking actually mirroring the barriers which you've seen before: the economic and financial, infrastructure, information and awareness, policy, legal, regulatory. You see institutional, organizational capacity, R&D. Next slide. Here you see in the graph, because TAP is a relatively new step in the TNA. Before we used to face project ideas. So now you can see the attention of countries in a phase 1 and phase 2 when undertaking TAP to the different elements of technology action plans. And you can see that many countries look at the activities to be implemented in both phases, or responsible authority in both phases. But then you also see in between phase 1 and 2, the guidance of TAPs was enhanced by the Technology Executive Committee, UNEP DTU. So parties had, they enjoyed to follow this new guidance that was in 2015-2016. And you also see the result, which we see the attention to each of these steps of the technology action plans had increased, and they've been better reported by countries. And this is a nice actually a diagram which shows the difference between phase 1 and phase 2 due to the tech and other partners' guidance. Next slide. The same you can see in adaptation. So before we had focus on mitigation. Again, you see the level of reporting had increased, which gives a reader of the TAP more overview on the action which are needed by countries in let's say medium to short-term horizons. Next slide. And this is not the the end of the process. It's the report, the synthesis report, the fourth synthesis report is covering a certain period of the process. So now we talk about 2009, 2017. We go ahead. Countries are still enjoying support of JEF in conducting their TNA, and also they're looking ahead to be connected, maybe through CTCN with GCF for supporting them in implementing the TNA results, such as TAPS. And at the moment, the process of project supports the work of least developed countries and small island developing states. And this is about to continue. There is one country, a large country at the moment, engaged in the process, which is Ukraine. The rest is LDCs and SIDS, and more than 20 LDCs are currently working on the TNA reports, and another 18 LDCs and SIDS will initiate their processes next year. So in 2022, or latest, we now a little bit delayed due to the pandemic situation, latest in 2023, almost half of the world countries will undertake the TNA process to identify their respective climate technology needs. And I will complete with our previous effort on not only looking at well-conducted TNAs, but also tracking the results of TNA. We try to look at the reports submitted vis-a-vis what, and you will hear that later from the next presenters, what technology have been realized, had made it to bring benefits to populations of these countries. So follow us further, and I'm looking forward to hear from you, your questions or comments to this presentation, and you can see the link where the fourth synthesis report is available for you to read and download. Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to you.
Thank you very much, Vladimir. That sound you heard, the alarm telling me that you have spent 10 minutes, so the timing was perfect. Thanks very much for that. And thanks for the presentation of the findings of this report. I mean, some of the issues you presented there are amazing and very interesting as well, particularly your description of the sectors that the countries highlighted in their TNAs, the energy, agriculture, water, tourism, and others. And particularly what you mentioned about the technology that are dominating in the list, particularly irrigation, crop desertification, and drought-resistant crops, and also the barriers that you highlighted, particularly economic and financial barriers. So thanks very much for that. I'm sure the report will make very good reading in understanding this aspect that the countries are struggling with. As I mentioned in my introduction, we will hear about some success stories as well, and some examples of countries that have actually successfully implemented their TNAs and their technology action plan. So now it gives me great pleasure to invite Diana Harutunian, I hope I pronounced your name properly, who's an expert in Armenia on climate change, but she's also a member of the UNFCCC CDM Executive Board. So Diana will share with us success stories that emerged from the TNA process in Armenia. So Diana, over to you for 10 minutes, please.
Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity to present Armenia's experience on technology needs assessment project, and mainly to show the follow-up results of TAP process and share our views with respect to audience of this climate dialogue. The importance of technology transfer, as was mentioned by Vladimir, on removing barriers for their application is critical for developing countries to be able to meet their commitments under Paris Agreement and build resilience and ensure sustainable development. Armenia is a landlocked country with fragile ecosystems, mountainous, and being a country without fossil fuel deposits, Armenia's transition to low-carbon development is critical for energy security, resilience, and green growth. Hence, all these are reflected in the Armenia's NDC, and now the government is finalizing NDC update, which set targets for 2030. In respect for needs assessment done by in Armenia, which creates good opportunity for building capacity and awareness among the different stakeholders, I would like to ask to change the slide. The project, as in other countries, was funded by the GF, and the Ministry of Environment was responsible national entity for this project, and Environmental Projects Implementation Unit supports the project operational. And this project next slide please, has the same three components and three phases of needs assessment, and I will concentrate on the technology action plan follow-up stages. And as this was mentioned also with Vladimir, several countries, most of the countries have TAPs in mitigation and adaptation sectors. So in Armenia, there was identified and prioritized 14 mitigation activities, technologies, and 5 of them can be classified as cross-cutting, and 6 adaptation technologies. As the mitigation actions prioritized for any country depends from national circumstances, climatic conditions, energy sector-specific developments, and certain technologies were prioritized in Armenia given that factors. The GHG inventory is the key reference for defining the subsectors, and with the highest was defined the highest share sectors with the GHG emissions and which have also real opportunities for mitigation. That is not accidental that building sector was targeted from the point of barriers and opportunities for technology transfer. As Armenia has a cold winters and the former municipal centralized heat supply was dilapidated, the cogeneration technology was considered as opportunity for attracting private investments in that technology. Thus, the regulatory environment and support for creating environment for this cogeneration technology to be attractive for private investments was used the district heating system renovation through regulatory environment creation. And on the next slide, you can see the status of the implemented projects, and you can see that cogeneration technology has been implemented in 2 important sites, and further scaling of this recommendation is included also in the Armenia and EU agreement for the accession to the EU, and it is included in the roadmap. Besides this, the energy efficiency in building sector was also prioritized, as the buildings, especially panel multi-apartment buildings, have very poor energy efficient characteristics, and this barriers removal was started with the GEF project, and currently this project is funded by GCF. And industrial energy audit is prioritized, and certain projects were pilotized, but the mandatory regulations are not yet in place. They are only voluntary in the country. But it's important, for example, the reactive capacity compensation technology, which was prioritized during this technology needs assessment, later on was included in the grid code, and now it is mandatory. And small type of renewable energies was prioritized. As for the grid-connected renewable energy situation in Armenia is quite supportive, and there are a lot of projects implemented in that direction due to proper tariff policy and policies. So the TNA prioritized the technologies for small solar heating systems as a local industry support, presented that. Next slide, please. And you can see on photos these cogeneration plants, which is supplying all medical university and hospitals surrounding this university. Next slide, please. Here is the district heating cogeneration plant with the attracted around 60 million private investments, and the plastic solar water heaters of this locally produced were installed in rural areas as it was cheap and reliable for a rural situation. Coming to the adaptation technologies, there was prioritized 6 technologies, and most of them was in the area of, as prioritized also by other countries in water sector, in land use and land use change. And from these 6 technologies, I can proudly say that all are now can be have proper direction for implementation. And on the next slide, you can see the details that, for example, about windbreak, these belts to be created. This is included in GCFAO, just a newly approved project. The local melioration and low volume drip irrigation technologies are piloted by several areas, but also with the small grant programs. And another adaptation technology for abundant tufa mining, waste processing and recultivation of these minings was included in adaptation fund project and is currently under implementation. Also was the need for recirculation of the water due to water shortage, and the reuse of the water is tested and proved as reliable and financially also possible technology by USAID project, and now it is stipulated also by the regulations. And drip irrigation and all other small but resilient building initiatives as advanced technologies in agriculture currently are supported by the government through the subsidizing reducing the credit interest rates of commercial banks for farmers. Next slide, please. And here you can see the examples of recirculation of the water, and due to that, around 60 hectares, for example, for one farm, 60 hectares of irrigation was used for the neighboring farms. And the wastewater treatment pond, this also is technology was tested in communities which are not connected to centralized sewage systems, and the treated water has a quality of reliable for irrigation. Next slide, please. And here are the technologies for amelioration of the degraded meadows. And there are also these technologies which are drip irrigation, anti-hail nets, and advanced technologies for more industrial orchards are also on the example of these communities where these are tested. Next slide, please, where I would like to bring some lessons from TNA process in Armenia, which can be interesting for others, is that the TNA addressed the needs for institutional coordination and contributed to the cooperation between scientific community, expert, policymakers, finance sector, so ensuring the intake of innovative ideas, brainstorming and perspective for scaling and feasibility of these technologies implementation. And it's important that the networking with the CTSN type of Armenia was created, the consortia of scientific and applied institutions, which are now the focal point for the technology transfer in Armenia. Methodologies used for prioritization compared to the phase 1 and phase 2 is good, that TNA guidelines were used, and the enhanced dialogue between specialists created to cross-cutting technologies to be prioritized. And some observations for future, as the feasibility of technology application in future can be ensured through private sector involvement and financial institutions, will be good to involve these institutions on early stage on TNA prioritization. And will be also important to look for know-hows and innovation ideas on places, because through that, networking with the companies or scientific institutions abroad or in developing countries can help to test and scale that technologies. And also is important maybe to see ongoing projects who have success or failure, and from this to extract the ideas for the recommended next steps. And also is important to consider all developments under the convention, available new financial instruments, mechanisms, and their programmatic directions. For example, if it is considered GF or green bonds or carbon taxing, or the opportunities under Article 6 of Paris Agreement, and they all have to be considered in the next TNAs. And also TNA process must be linked with NDC implementation plan and priorities of the countries. And as CDM executive board member, I also can ensure that CDM created a lot of momentum in developing countries for technology transfer, and special edition was about promoting technology transfer through the CDM process, where the lead of the private sector was important to bring these technologies and implement them in developing countries and LDCs as well. And thank you for this opportunity, and ready to answer to your questions.
Well, thank you very much, Diana. That was very comprehensive. Thank you for sharing this experience in Armenia and the 6 technologies in particular that you've implemented in buildings with regard to energy efficiency, also agriculture and water. The examples of implementations that you gave, they're very interesting, particularly the ones on plastic solar water heaters in rural areas, and the wastewater treatment plant and the restoration of degraded meadows. And thank you also for sharing the lessons learned from this experience and your suggestions for future as well. That's very much appreciated. Thank you. Obviously, with all these activities and the implementation of activities, they can't really happen without financial support. And this is the next session we're moving on now, the next presentation, financial support in conducting the TNAs. And this is provided by GEF, the Global Environment Facility, through the Global TNA project, which is implemented by UNEP DTU partnership. The UNEP DTU partnership, together with the Secretariat to the UNFCCC, they track the implementation of technology action plans in developing countries. So I am very pleased now to invite our third speaker, Sarah Trera, the head of the Technology Transition and Systems Innovation section at UNEP DTU partnership. And she is also the manager of the GEF-funded Global TNA project. Sarah will share with us some additional success stories from various countries that emerged from the implementation of the TNA process. Sarah, for 10 minutes, over to you.
Thank you very much, Situni, and also let me thank the Secretariat for, of course, inviting me to speak and share experiences during this event, but also for the continuous effort in actually supporting countries in reaching implementation of their TNA and TAPs. So with this, let me move to my next slide, please. And then just before I start taking you through some examples of implementation countries have reached, I would just like to take you just one step back and give you a little bit of context, because there's a lot of efforts that countries are bringing to the table, so to speak, before they reach their technology action plans. The TNAs are a set of very much country-driven activities that have a high national ownership, meaning that the process is led by a national TNA coordinator and a team of nationally selected consultants and national consultants. And it is this team that drives the process throughout the main steps of the TNAs, all the way from identifying and prioritizing technologies, analyzing barriers, enabling frameworks, and preparing technology action plans, leading to project ideas and concept notes. And throughout this whole process, there's a strong stakeholder engagement with national experts. And with this, I'll give you some examples of what countries have used their technology action plans for, stemming from this process. So as a first example, I've here included Cambodia, who completed their TNA and TAP in 2013. They built a project proposal for the GEF based on its TNA report that was in support of existing national sustainable development and adaptation plans, but also to support the larger scale adoption of renewable energy technologies and building adaptive capacity in the agricultural sector. So it was to support more than 10,000 smallholder farmers by increasing their adaptive capacity, but also through upscaling the use of technologies such as biodigesters and solar energy systems to add agricultural value. And this came from a project submitted and approved by the GEF, and also as an essential part in this proposal was the information generated through the TNA project. Next slide, please. For Thailand, which completed its TNA in 2012, they identified waste management and waste to energy conversion as key priorities in their TNA project. They built on a project preparation grant from the GEF, a large scale proposal where they received US dollars 3.15 million, but not least they managed to generate co-funding from 3 participating municipalities, which actually amounted to $182 million in co-financing. So this was an example of how a country have built again on the analysis assessments in their TNA work. They used the project preparation grant and upscaled the implementation through a large-scale project, both with the government, with municipalities, and also in this case with the UNDP. Next slide, please. And I know Situni is very strict on time, so I will keep it to the point. So Mongolia completed its TNA in 2013 and had as a priority and a focus the upscale of energy technologies, both in terms of renewable energies and also for energy efficiency. And for Mongolia, we saw Hasbank, which I believe was the first private entity to be accredited to the Green Climate Fund. They actually built on the information generated in the TNAs on what are the barriers for upscaling certain energy technologies. And building on that, they actually have had approval of 3 different activities from the GCF, and you can actually see it listed here. So they had an energy efficient consumption loan program, a renewable energy program, and also a micro, small and medium enterprises business loan program. All these building upon recommendations from the TNA. Next slide, please. So moving to the African context, we have seen Eswatini, who completed their TNA in 2018. They prioritized technologies for adaptation that included wetland protection, conservation agriculture, agroforestry, and livestock selective breeding. These technologies were integrated into a project which was called the Ecolabambo Biosphere Project under the auspices of UNESCO. They also integrated it into the Green Climate Fund proposal, as well as in their readiness program. In addition, they have already received funding also from the African Climate Fund of the value of $1.3 million, also to support implementation and upscale of these adaptation technologies. Eswatini also used both the methodology they had used under the TNA process for prioritization, identification and analysis of technologies. They used that for preparing their NDC work, and they actually built on the working groups that they had also established under the TNA project for the carrying on the adaptation NDC work. So here we also have a close link between the institutional capacity development that was made during the TNA process. And in addition, they also integrated the TNA priorities into their NDC. Next slide, please. So coming to, I think it's my last example, which was Tunisia, who also completed their TNA in 2018. They identified hybrid vehicles as a key priority in their TNA report. It is a technology which at that point was not in the market in Tunisia. There was missing regulatory frameworks, lack of approved standards, and in general quite a low knowledge of the technologies amongst experts in the sector in Tunisia. So based on the recommendations derived from the TNAs and TAPs, the government have now introduced a national program in support of hybrid cars to establish the enabling framework conditions, and also including that, building the capacity of relevant stakeholders. Next slide, please. And just before I finish my presentation, I'd just like to draw your attention to a new guidebook that we have launched under the TNA process as an additional guidance to countries. We have quite already an elaborate methodology with numerous guidances for each step of the process. But we felt, and this was also reported by the countries we are working with, that there is a lack, of course, of financing, which is identified as Vladimir also mentioned in his presentation, as the most important barrier to technology transfer, implementation, diffusion, and uptake. But in addition to finance as a key barrier, it is also contributing to that, the domestic capacity in actually achieving the finance for project implementation and for creating these enabling frameworks. So based on this, we decided to prepare and also to integrate in our capacity building program during the TNA and TAP process, this guidebook on financing. So it is on how the TNA stakeholders can prepare and develop sound business cases for the interventions or technologies that they identify through this process. And it is our hope that with this we can support countries in even further implementation of their priorities identified through this process. Next and final slide. So if you are interested to learn more on the support we provide to countries, but most importantly also the reports countries are producing, stories on how countries are using their TNAs and TAPs, technology action plans, then you can find more information on the websites. And we also have an online database where you can easily get an overview of which countries have prioritized what technologies and sectors. So I will stop my presentation here. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Sarah. We have 20 seconds to spare. Thank you for that. Now, thank you for your presentation and for adding really to the example that Diana showed from Armenia, and shows the spectrum of coverage of support of TNAs, and particularly what you mentioned about Tunisia, looking at the hybrid vehicles. So again, is another strand which is very interesting really in terms of technology support. And thanks to the GCF funding, particularly the readiness program, that's very interesting to see the linkage to that as well. And finally, the finance guide for the TNA's implementation, that's extremely useful. And I'm sure that colleagues who are asking so many questions about financial support will find that particularly useful, and how to go about accessing financial support for the implementation of the TNA. So thanks for that, and thanks to three speakers. Before we move on to the panel, just stay online because we have three questions, and I suggest you turn your cameras on, Sarah, Vladimir, and Diana, because I have one question for each one of you. And if you could please take them briefly, and we'll move on to the panel in a second. So let me start with Vladimir. There was a question here saying, Would you please elaborate more on the TAPs developed as part of the TNA process, especially the budget request on mitigation and adaptation? From your perspective, how could these technology-related actions be supported?
Thank you for the question. The budgets, and you can see that on my slides, they've been elaborated more and more in details with countries. They always related to a proposed action, and they also related to a proposed period of that activity is taking place. So we may have two levels of budget briefly, an assessment of total cost of an action, or we may elaborate deeper and have a budget per sub-activities, whether this is feasibility study or procurement steps or activities for software, hardware. Don't forget also that the TAP may also, it's not only containing hardware, but we may have also actions like legislation improvement, or we may have action like looking at tax and fiscal incentives, and they're also budgeted by countries. Now, there is two ways of supporting TNAs. One way is support conduction of TNA, which we are thankful for Jeff on doing so, and for a long time, more than 2 decades. The second is support of actions identified in TNA to be implemented, to be realized. This is needed, and we are a little bit looking how can we help countries when they finalize their TNA project, what they're gonna do with the results, how they're gonna bring them to reality. So one way is really an effort of GCF, which will be also discussed here further, which we can, where the countries can use that. Concrete finance for concrete project. The second is maybe more promotion of these results, more events where funding institutions may be allowed to study this work, and sort of from matchmaking events through promotional activities run by countries. This is also bringing us to new territory of finance, including also private funders. And I finalized, we have done a webinar there together with Sarah and other funders. That was done in September, trying to connect the TAPs with people who are investing in projects such as renewables in regions such as Africa. And we're going to continue this work in future. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Vladimir. Diana, the question is, how can we promote the engagement of private sector in this process?
I think that I will continue the statements that was in the answer of Vladimir. So the government and the project which is implemented with the support of UNFD2 is looking also to the soft technologies, regulations, barriers, because the methodology is used for root cause analysis for barriers for certain technologies. And examples that I brought shows that, for example, for making private sector to invest, there must be secured investments for the cogeneration and for the payback through electricity generated by the cogeneration plant. In this case, their investments will be shorter, and the private sector will be interested to invest in cogeneration because it's not cheap technology, but through guarantee of electricity purchase, the returns of investments can be assured. Or with the small grant program, there was investment done in the charging stations, for the example that Sarah was bringing on electrical mobility, because charging stations, for example, if they are absent in the country, the cars will face the problems. So with the small scale project, with the small grant program, in Armenia was installed charging stations, and after regulations for the tax incentives for import of electromobiles, in 1 year, 10 times the import of the cars was increased, and now the country will start another phase of support. So these are the small things, but they are critical for big money to come in technology promotion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Diana. Last question to you, Sarah, from Radha Wogel from Nepal. What is the policy to increase women's access to climate-friendly technology? How relevant is gender consideration during TNAs?
Thank you very much for that good question. And it is something that we started to consider some years back and led to launching a new guidebook. I actually grabbed one I had here behind me, a French version, but how to do a gender responsive TNAs. And the way we are viewing it is that we see it from two different perspectives and integrating it in two different ways. So we look at the gender balance in the national TNA teams, also the working groups, and who are consulted along the process. So one thing is the whole stakeholder engagement and national teams. So we seek a gender balance in that sense, but then also throughout preparing the TNAs and TAPs. So this means that gender criteria are integrated also in identifying and prioritizing technologies, and also in viewing what are barriers sensitive to different groups, inclusive of gender imbalances. So, and also in terms of preparing technology action plans, are there specific aspects to consider when it comes to gender? So it is something that we are considered and are actively integrating in the work and the capacity building we provide to countries, and countries are integrating it into their work. So in those most recent reports, you will see gender aspects taking a much more significant role than it was previously. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Diana and Vladimir. So thanks very much for setting the scene during this session. And thank you to colleagues who asked these important questions. Let's move on now to the second session of this event, where we'll be having a panel discussion to talk about the supporting of the implementation of the technology action plans and how can we enhance this support even further. And for this, we have 5 panelists, which I would like to introduce now. And as I introduce your names, please turn your camera and your mic on. Maxwell Otin Onapa, who's the NDE from Uganda. So he's the Director of Science Research and Innovation at the Ministry of Science, Technology and Innovation in Uganda. Welcome, Maxwell. We also have Katia Kwang Idba from GEF. She's climate change specialist with the GEF Secretariat. Welcome, Katia. It's very early for you. I know you're joining us from Washington. It's very early morning for you. Thank you for making the effort. Emerson Rizonde from the GCF, Climate Policy Still at the Green Climate Fund. Welcome, Emerson. Trust is very early for you as well. Is Emerson with us?
Yes,
yeah, I don't see him. You are.
I am. Can you see me? My camera is on.
We don't see you yet. Oh, we can see you now. Great. Okay. Thanks for joining us. Rajiv Garg from the Climate Technology Center Network. He is the managing CTCN of activities in Africa and West Asia and the Commonwealth of Independent States. Rajiv, welcome. Thanks for joining us. Please turn your camera on. And Romeo Bertolini from the NDC Partnership. Romeo is the Deputy Director at Country Engagement NDC Partnership Support Unit. So welcome, Romeo, as well. So we have five panelists. I'll ask you all to turn your cameras on, please. So we will have intervention from each of the panelists, and I really like to leave some time for questions and answers afterward. So I'll ask each one of you if you could make your initial intervention for around 4 minutes. This would be much appreciated, and we'll have the chance to say more during the questions and answers. So what I would like to do during this session, as I said, is talk about the implementation and how we can enhance it. And I'll start with Maxwell, particularly in the case of Uganda, and just to ask you, what action did Uganda undertake after finalizing the TNA, and how did you do this? You need to turn your mic on, Maxwell.
Thank you, Zituni. You've already introduced me. I need to first of all inform you that Uganda is a participant in this phase of the TNA, and we've been conducting the exercise for the last couple of years. Ideally, the contract should have expired, but because of the disruptive nature of COVID-19, there's an extension that's going to be put in place. And our TNA comes as a follow-up on another one that we had done in 2006. And that I identified a number of areas, particularly emphasizing at that time the core benefits, both adaptation and mitigation. And I just want to speak to this because we want to create a link in terms of what was obtaining at that time. What did we identify, and what did we do to bring us to the present situation? So first of all, we take note that at that time the NDCs were not yet there. So the approach was basically the criteria that was quite universal, and a number of technology-based recommendations based on the technologies that were prioritized in the different sectors were highlighted in the energy sector, in the agriculture subsector, in forestry, industry, and these were the key sectors that were identified at that time, as well as transport, solid waste, and housing sector. And I must say that as far as energy is concerned, I think we've made we've made some very good gains, because key among the technologies that were identified was improved combustion technologies, small-scale hydropower. And in that aspect, Uganda has made a lot of strides, because we now have lots of not lots, at least quite a number of mini hydros, as well as actually large-scale hydros, because we have the two large ones that are coming on. One is coming on board soon, is the Karuma one, which is about 600 megawatts. The other one that is operating is already 183 megawatts. So I think that is something worth celebrating. Then more so, the solar PV, I think has taken a huge leap over time, and it is really now kind of like in a self-driven mode, because the private sector has got in and doing a great deal. In agriculture, what was identified at that time was organic farming. Largely, we do a lot of organic farming, because if you look at organic farming in terms of really, using the conventional methods, I think that is what has been going on. But what caught up on us is because rice is eaten a lot in the country, upland rice was recommended. Upland rice cultivation was recommended as an intervention in agriculture. And I think that has also taken a huge turn. Forestry subsector has done pretty well, because there are lots of forest plantation. The downside there, of course, is that we are mainly looking at exotic trees, pines and eucalyptus, and there are debates around there. Industry, yes, mainly issues of improved combustion, And I think a number of industries, particularly in the cement industries, have done quite well. Now, the newest addition as we transition now to the second phase of, to this phase of TNA is in the area of transportation, where Uganda has taken a trend to support the development of electric vehicle. There's a small step that has been taken. There's a small company, a government company that is working that area. As a matter of fact, there are prototypes of solar buses that are already plying our routes, especially in the city center. Now, moving fast forward, the current TNA has mainly been guided by our MDCs, and our priority as a country is actually adaptation. But having said that, the different sectors that have been prioritized are not any different from what was prioritized originally. Agriculture is still on top, forestry, infrastructure, water, energy, health, as well as disaster risk management. We know we suffer a lot from landslides. So we have done barrier analysis, and the next step now, of course, is going to TNA. We haven't, rather not TNA, a technology action plan, and that's the phase in which we are, having walked through all this journey. The next step will now be development of TAPS. So I think I'll wait and address the questions later. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's really very, very useful, and for highlighting the priority sectors there. Again, energy and agriculture in particular, and talking about the next phase of TNAs and the things you want to look at, particularly in the transport sector, looking at electric vehicles, and the fact that the TNAs are guided by the NDCs in Uganda. So thanks for highlighting that. Let me now move on to the next panelists, Katya, Emerson, and Rajiv. And I want to ask you the same questions. How does your organization support countries in their TNAs? And could you share some success stories with us, if possible, on that? So let me start with you, Katya.
Hi. Good morning. Thank you, Zaytouni, for the introduction. I'm really happy to participate in this dialogue virtually, even though it's really early here in DC. I will be brief, just to provide kind of some background on how the GEF has provided support for TNAs. So the GEF has been an early supporter of TNAs, as you all probably have heard through the presentations of previous presenters. We've been supporting TNAs since GEF 3, which is almost 20 years ago. And at that time, we were funding an initial round of TNAs as what we call top-ups to national communications. That was followed by, in GEF 4, we approved the first phase of the TNA Global Support Project. And that first phase of the project supported between 35 and 45 eligible countries to prepare or update TNAs. And this was part of the POSNA Strategic Program on Technology Transfer, which was introduced around the same time. And under the PSP, TNA support was a key element for supporting technology transfer under that framework. In GEF 5, we continued to support the preparation and updating of TNAs for those countries which requested it. And in GEF 6, we made a support eligible for small island developing states and least developed countries, LDCs, from a focal area set aside. And what that means is that countries were able to access financing without taking away from their national allocation under the STAR resource allocation program of the GEF. So currently we're in GEF 7, which started in 2018. And we have continued to provide the set-aside support for LDCs and SIDS in GEF 7. We've recently approved in June 2019 the fourth phase of the Global TNA Support Project, which was endorsed by our CEO in July 2020, which was just this past summer. So with the 4 phases, we've provided around $27 million in financing towards TNA support, supporting over 90 countries in 4 phases of this project. So in terms of success stories, the GEF, when we receive funding requests from these countries, a large amount of, they have to, all the countries requesting financing have to demonstrate alignment with national climate change policies and UNFCCC kind of work streams. So that includes national communications, NDCs, and TNAs. So there is a little bit more work for us to do in documenting the kind of bridge between TNAs and then the action that's taken by countries individually that kind of scale up and put the TNAs into action into full-size projects. But we've actually started working on that with other partners, and we're going to continue looking into how we can more effectively publicize these types of success stories. Although every time I participate in these types of events, I hear of country level examples of how TNAs have supported really good work, including GEF and GCF projects that follow on and build on to the good work that's undertaken in the TNAs. In terms of how we can support this process going forward, I would say that coordination between the focal points of the different kind of processes, such as the GEF replenishment and the NDEs, and focal points under different UNFCCC work streams. I think the increased coordination is really, really important to maximizing higher achievement in delivering the type of action we want to see as a follow-up to a TNA. So that's a type of cooperation and collaboration that we're hoping to see more of going forward and going into GEF 8, which starts in 2022. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Katya. And it's interesting that GEF has been providing support to TNA since GEF 3, which is almost 20 years ago, as you said. That's fantastic, and especially the support to SIDS and LCs, and thanks also for highlighting the importance of coordination between the different focal points. You're absolutely right, because that's very beneficial to countries as well, to have really that coordination to maximize the support that they need. Emerson, GCF obviously is much newer than GEF in this field, but we already heard that at least in the RENESS program, there is a big interest in accessing that support from GCF. So how does GCF support the TNAs?
Well, first of all, thank you so much, and morning, afternoon, and evening to everybody. It's a pleasure to be here participating in another conversation about TNAs and technology. I think the very first good news that I want to share with everybody is the approval of our updated strategic plan by the board earlier in November. And what that means for technology and TNA. Well, there is a very concrete mention to technology supports throughout the document, but in particular to TNA. We have been supporting TNA, of course, not as long as our cousin, the GEF, because we are newer on the block. We started with our first project approved in 2015, but I'm very happy to report that in these last 5 years, we have approved more than almost 400 readiness projects for nearly 140 countries around the world. A number of them contains technology elements. And what is the interest of the GCF in supporting technology, and how TNA plays an important role there? Well, TNA is basically that X-ray that tells a picture about technology needs. And we are interested in financing those needs through the funding proposals. And we basically have two windows to do that. The first one, as Zitoni mentioned, is through the readiness program. So countries can come to us. Every country have a budget to use of up to $1 million per year per country for readiness activities. And through that, they can, for example, develop a technology needs assessment action plan. And after that action plan, we can be part of a funding proposal, a larger project that has already identified the needs, and those needs are part of this project. And then the sky is the limit, because there's no cap on how much a project can be worth. I'll take the example of Uganda, because we had Maxwell with us here. We have him with us. And just for Uganda alone, the GCF has approved in total 9 projects. Some of these projects are multi-country projects, so Uganda participates along other countries, but all of them have some elements, some degree of technology in the project that was approved. And many of them we can say that was, if not identified through a TNA supported by the GEF or the GCF, but I think that construction is started with a TNA. I think another important elements that I can also highlight here, and again about Uganda and the GEF, is the work on e-mobility. We heard Maxwell speaking about that in Uganda. We are very thrilled to be working with the GEF, because the GEF has pioneered an important work on a global e-mobility program. So we are trying to identify ways on how we can scale that up. Basically look at countries where the GEF has already started some work with these countries that is promising, that has potential, that has already some commitments, but some results for us to see potential for bringing that, not necessarily just adding more zeros and making the project larger, but looking at elements that we could bring different stakeholders to the table, increase the elements of co-financing with different financial instruments, for example, not necessarily just grants. We could be looking at different tranches of loans as well. But where are we with these at the moment? Discussions have already started with the GEF. We had held, I think it was 2 weeks ago, an annual event between all climate fund heads. Carlos Manuel, the new CEO of the GEF, was there. Also the CIFS and the Adaptation Fund with our executive director. And there was, I think, a very interesting common understanding that looking at ways to scale up each other is important, and looking at technology, particularly on the elements of first loss, high risk technology that require to have someone, putting the money there for that first loss. And I think that's an important place where the GCF can play a role to support countries with something we have been doing. And when you look back for this previous 5 years, we can see that year after year, from 2018 to 19 and now 20, we approved a higher number of readiness projects. We have approved a higher number of projects with technology components. We are disbursing more money, and I feel that there are yet barriers and challenges that we need to surpass. And some of these challenges are particularly related to the administrative part on the ground, which means you have the readiness approved or you have the project approved, but now it comes to the implementation phase. And we have had so many challenges this year, right? COVID is one of them, and the speed of getting things on the ground with the implementing agencies, partners, stakeholders, and so on. But we keep addressing these challenges. I think there's elements of capacity building that we want to keep working with countries, and I'm very confident that we'll keep improving and hopefully bringing more good news about technology in the future. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Emerson. That's really great news that the GCF is supporting technology and TNAs. And good news, as you mentioned, the approval of the strategic plan by the GCF board for technology support. And the fact that you have around 400 readiness projects with some technology elements in them. So that's really good news to hear. And the point you highlighted that capacity building is absolutely critical. I think there's still many countries obviously who need that capacity develop proposals and projects to be able to access finance. So thank you for that. Let me just check that Rajiv is online. The Climate Technology Center Network. Rajiv, are you with us?
Yeah, Zitouni, I'm here.
Can you turn your camera on, or is it not possible? That's good. We can see you now. Okay. The same question to you, Rajiv, for the Climate Technology Center Network, CTCN. How does it support TNA?
Okay, Zitouni, very shortly, or in a very summarized fashion, means CTCN works on the basis of demand from the country. It's a demand-driven approach. Since its establishment, we have supported more than 100 countries in more than 240 requests for technical assistance. And all of these are related to technologies, be it mitigation technologies or be it adaptation technology. Capacity building is an integral part of all our technical assistance, either it be directly or through indirectly by using some of the stakeholders. These requests for technical assistance are on varied topics, both on mitigation and adaptation, on energy, on water, on agriculture, on renewable energy, so forth and so on. And even some of them are in new advanced technologies like OETC, ocean thermal energy conversion and things like that. So means we have in the last 4 years a huge experience of delivering on technical assistance on technology transfer issues. Specifically, when it comes to the technology need assessments or the TNAs, in the very recent past, we have been approached by the countries to revise and update their TNAs, although they have done it a couple of times. TNAs is kind of, I would say, grandfathered by the NDCs and now the revised NDCs. So some of the elements which were there in the earlier TNAs are also part of are also part of the NDCs and the revised NDCs. So for about 7 countries, as of now, we are implementing or we are helping them to revise their TNAs, and that is all through the GCF readiness program. And the countries are Iraq, Syria, Gabon, Equatorial Guinea, and DRC, Cameroon, and Nigeria. And even this year, something like 7 to 8 countries approached us. They wanted to revise their TNAs. We have prepared the GCF readiness program, and it is in the pipeline. The trend, what we are seeing in the revision of the TNAs are the following. Countries are becoming more and more interested on topics related to how they can engage their small and medium scale enterprises, how they can increase the efficiency of their SMEs and ensure private sector participation in identification of technologies, in identification of needs, of their needs, and how it can be overcome. The second important thing which we are looking at in these TNAs, or we are trying to look at, depending on the demand of the country, is how to establish a sustainable institutions which promotes innovative technology, like the one in Georgia. The Georgia revision of the TNA, they are looking at to strengthen an institution which they call Green Innovation Center, which they want to strengthen so that this innovative technologies and development of national system of innovation can be undertaken by a local institution. The third important thing is quite a number of countries are asking in their TNAs to develop GCF concept notes. Now, these GCF concept notes are going to lead to direct access of funding in the future from the GCF part of funds, both in the case of adaptation and mitigation. So, and these are some of the examples. I would also like to state here is that some of the areas which had been identified in the earlier TNAs, the countries are coming back to us with a request to dive more deep into it, develop a kind of a protocol and a whole systemic approach at a much deeper level. And the example which I pick up here is Tunisia. So Tunisia, they had in their TNA, which was earlier conducted, something related to the water sector. They wanted to improve the water sector. They wanted to reduce the line losses, and they wanted to identify why are there so much losses in the network, in the water piping network, and also why are the bills not coming on time, or how they can track pilferages and these kind of issues. So again, we have put up a proposal to the GCF detailing in again readiness program, detailing in what steps needs to be done, and to develop a business model and identify technology for remotely monitoring and matching how much water supply is there, how much losses could be there, where are the main losses, what are the main sources of revenue loss and things like that. But this is not so simple. We can develop a model, but implementation of this requires a whole change in the water sector, means it requires a much larger effort. What we are developing is developing a protocol and a system which would help country overcome it, but implementation would be another large scale effort, means more than $100 million or something like that, even for a small area.
Okay.
But this has been rooted in the earlier TNAs, and we are more than happy to take it up. Last point is, most of the means we did a kind of an internal analysis, and we identified that 40% of our technical assistance requests which we are delivering on is somewhere rooted in the earlier TNAs which have been done. That's all from my side. Thank you.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Rajiv. And it's good news to hear that CTCN has been supporting more than 100 countries on technology for both mitigation and adaptation. And the fact that capacity building is an integral part of what the CTCN provides as support to countries. And also, thank you for the element highlighted on the revision of TNA, particularly the increasing interest in engaging SMEs in this process. Thank you for that. Let me just check that Romeo is also joining us from the NDC partnership. Romeo, are you with us?
Yes, I'm here. Can you see?
Yes, we can see you now. Thank you. I will ask you another question with regard to the linkages between NDCs and TNAs. You heard Rajiv from CTCN saying that TNAs are grandfathered by the NDCs. So in your opinion, then, what are the possible synergies between NDCs and TNAs, and how could this be strengthened further? Over to you.
Thank you so much. Just two technical things. I cannot see the chat for some reason. I have no idea why that is the case. And sometimes my computer goes rogue and creates a lot of noise, so that my colleagues tell me I sound like Darth Vader. So let me know when that happens.
Okay, we hear you very well.
Okay, that's good news. Thanks a lot, and thanks Vladimir, thanks colleagues. Many of you I know from past events. Great to hear from you, and always happy to provide some insights here from the side of the NDC partnership, of which basically all of you are a member of, with your countries, of your institutions. Let me make sure I brief you a little bit on 2-3 things. Number one would be this linkage. I think it is very interesting. I was looking back into the decision on the working group on technology and from 2017. And I think this paper that I think was from the SBs in Bonn in 2017 in September was doing a great job in summarizing and making this linkage between the NDCs and the TNAs. And actually, I would take it the other way around. The TNAs actually are the grandfather to some extent of the NDCs in terms of the technology and the methodology and the instrument. I think you could say that even looking at NDCs after Copenhagen, they are a little bit oriented towards national activities and needs assessments. So I think that is probably the right way to look at it. Nevertheless, NDCs got broader, and the linkage that you have been creating there in this very good paper is about how to integrate this responsibilities of TNA and NDC coordination across sectors and ministries. So where is the institutional arrangement for that? And look into the strong linkages between both the processes and the sector activities, and ensure the exchange of good practices of information, including arrangement and involvement of the relevant stakeholders. So I think that is something that with the NDC partnership and as a member-based kind of coalition has tried to do, making sure that there's this link between technology and the NDCs. We have been identifying a couple of examples from our country engagement, and I'm sure you know a little bit how we work. We've been working in Tunisia and Uganda, in Armenia, of course, a lot, and we've been asking basically the countries we are dealing with, what are your focal areas when it comes to NDC engagement, and also in the revision phase we are right now, also in the revision phase. And you've mentioned a lot of the sectors that are relevant also there. It's waste, water, AFOLU, the agriculture, forest and land use, energy, needless to say to that, buildings, energy efficiency and so forth. So these are investments, these are requests both in terms of TA and in financial cooperation investments that are put on the table, that we matchmake as this kind of clearinghouse mechanism, and transfer also to those that are taking up this the responsibility to implement these kind of or support the implementation of these kind of programs within the NDC as such, and that are the IFIs, bilateral donors, but first and foremost the countries we are dealing with. And I think there are three things that make this link very, very important, and where we should and where we do actually work together already. One link is obviously that we identify the projects that have a strong technology aspect, and these are a lot, obviously, and make sure that they are reflected in NDCs, and the other way around. The NDCs not coming from out of the blue, completely off the ground, making use of the learning and the experience we had from the grandfathering TNA, so to speak, and the work you've been doing and explaining so well for 10, 12, and even more years. The second one, I think, is this capacity building aspect that is not to underestimate. I think countries like my own, I'm half German, half Italian, at least the Germans can support to some extent experimenting with technologies, and we've been doing that a lot with our PV system, with wind, both in environmental conditions that are not necessarily favorable and made it pretty expensive. Yet the market took off, and there was an export component to this, and an export component at the beginning. At the end of the day, it was a technology transfer, really, with India and China being really the big producers of photovoltaic installations and wind energy, respectively. So this kind of stuff is very important. Capacity building, technology transfer, making the right choice for the technology to be applied in a country. You know, that needless to say that that there is some capacity and some know-how available, but also the exchange on these kind of things is very important. And that again is, I think, something that this TNA community can relate to, and in ways of peer-to-peer learning, for instance, exchange on what are the right choices. What do I need to consider when I'm thinking about applying a certain technology? What are the external effects? What are the damage, the lock-in consequences I have when I go along a more conservative path and a low-tech or old-tech kind of path that may at the beginning be more attractive in terms of the investment and running costs, but on the long run be much more expensive when it comes to sustainability, CO2 and adaptation aspects. And then the third one, I think, which
Sorry, Romeo, I have some questions I would like to ask people, so I ask everyone to speak for 5 minutes. You highlighted the most important point on capacity building. I'll come back to you on that. We have 3 minutes left, and I would like to ask some questions from the audience. So thank you for that. We have a couple of questions, and you're welcome to come in, Romeo, as well, on capacity building aspect, because there is a question on that. But let me start with Katya and Emerson. There's a question here on how can the current mechanisms, and I think here they refer to GEF and GCF, how can the current mechanism enhance capacity building in developing countries, especially in the innovation ability? So if I start with you, Katya, and then Emerson, very briefly, please. Katya?
Hi, yeah, thanks for the question. Oh, let me turn my video on, sorry. Capacity building is generally, well, I work on the adaptation program specifically, primarily. So most of my experience at the GEF has been heavily with LDCs. And within the LDC context, almost every project we receive has a capacity building element in it. We don't just provide financing for hard infrastructure without some type of capacity building activity. So it's a very important part, we recognize, of projects, especially for those including technology elements. So those always come bundled with some type of capacity building, but also we've also financed numerous types of capacity building programs where individual countries participate as part of like a global project or a regional project. So there are also those as well that encourage kind of South-South support for each other, as well as financing for new technologies and innovation.
Great, thank you. Emerson?
No, thank you for that. I think similarly to the GEF, I think there are two parts to answer these. One is providing capacity building within the context of the projects that we are financing, and also providing capacity building in the context pre-project, which is through the readiness program. But in addition to that, and specifically to the context of technology, we've been developing something that's called the Climate Innovation Facility, and that is about providing support for incubators and accelerators, and hopefully in the future having also a growth fund dedicated to help developing countries to come up with good ideas on technologies that are specifically to the context of that country. I have reported to the meetings of the TEC and CTCN earlier this semester about status of that. Unfortunately, because of the coronavirus, we were also impacted on the developments of this facility because of connection with stakeholders, consultations, and so. But the next step is to identify one accredited entity that will be able to take this project forward. There are discussions already happening with some countries, with some entities, and that will provide this, I think, element of solution, because you won't find silver bullets. But again, we also been learning a lot from other funds, including the GEF, connected with CTCN, also with support of the TEC on moving this forward.
Thank you. I have questions for Rajiv and Maxwell as well, but let me bring in Romeo first, because he started commenting on capacity building. would you like to add something on what Katya and Emerson said?
Yeah, I think, well, I think that capacity building must enable the decision makers, and not necessarily those that sit in environmental ministries, but also those that are in charge of the budget and the spending in the sectors, to make the right choices. And that's what I meant. You cannot afford, as a least developed country, go on a wrong, non-sustainable path. And that I think is the one a very important issue that you need to consider. What kind of technology do you apply, and what kind of investment is there, and what is the best way to decide on that, given investment costs, running costs, and long-term sustainability issues. And at the end of the day, what can I do to scale it up? How can I connect this to the country, to the country's budgeting, to the big pots of money? I would say, not necessarily the sectoral ones, which we are basically talking about, but also the programming of the bigger IFIs, the big bilateral donors, and not least, obviously, applying intelligent mechanisms involving the private sector.
Okay, thank you. Maxwell, the question to you is also related to capacity building, so you may want to come in. You know, what are a few important strategies that can strengthen capacity to back TNAs? Is exactly in the same topic before I answer Rajiv the next question.
Yeah, thank you, Zaitoon. I think one of the in the course of our conducting this TNA, one of the things that we learned is that the level of participation by different stakeholders is very important. In the process, if you make it as inclusive as possible, then you can harness lots of knowledge and inputs from different players, and also it gives that the sense of ownership for the country if you make it as inclusive as possible. So I think that's a very key point that we need to leverage. And then we believe that rather than a very dichotomous approach of mitigation vis-a-vis adaptation, it is good to front a synergistic approach where for every step you look at core benefits. And I think that maximizes the benefit of the process. The other thing that I think is also very important, especially in the point of technology transfer, we are beginning to see that the issue, the capacity to have ability to incubate some of these technologies, they may be technologies that are being transferred from outside, or even indigenous technologies that are from within. The ability to have opportunity to incubate these technologies, develop prototypes, and then roll them to the market, I think is a very key in the process going forward. And of course, again, when it comes now to the action plan, there are certain barriers that are very constraining and they cut across. And I think for the approach of a low-hanging fruit, to go for technologies that have the least barriers but the most effect, I think is very key. Unfortunately, in our process, because of the process we went through, a lot of the technologies that we identified are actually kind of like public good. Most of them would require a lot of government intervention, institutional research, and all this and that, with very minimal way for private sector participation. So I think that has to be looked into so that the process will allow us to identify technologies that opens opportunities for the private sector.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Rajiv, there was a question here, particularly on the impact actually of TNA's process in the development and transfer of technology. So I wonder if you may want to comment on that, especially on what CTCN is doing to support countries. So what is the impact of TNAs in the transfer of technology?
You know, from our experience, Zitouni, the biggest impact of the TNA process is capacity building itself. The countries now have the capacity to identify, or have started getting capacity to identify technologies, to identify the areas which they would like to focus on using a methodological approach. And what it has turned into is that it has started creating markets in the region, and private sector can only be engaged when there is a sizable market. And this is helping countries, if the countries come together and identify a specific market. So a whole region opens up in terms of market available for the private sector, and therefore an enhanced interest of the private sector. So the biggest thing which I see, which the TNAs have done, is creating a capacity within the country to identify specific technologies, leading to a kind of a market growth and consolidation of the market in the region. So although it is going to be more visible in the next 5 to 10 years when more implementation work would have been done, but the effects are already there to see. And I also see on my chat box there is an additional question, if you want me to address that what could be an ideal international mechanism to support the implementation of actions identified by the TNAs. To this, very briefly, I would say that there has to be enhanced partnership and coordination between the technology and the financing mechanism. And means if these two bodies can start working more and more closely, more and more results would come out which are going to be more visible.
Okay, thank you, Rajiv, and thank you everyone, all the three speakers earlier, but also the panelists. We had to overrun a little bit because I could see on the chat there were so many important questions, and we needed really to take some of them to make this more interactive and be considerate to the colleagues who are watching us and following this debate. And I won't try to sum up in detail, really, just to say that some important points that I picked up from this is that this has to be an inclusive process, really, in making it successful and involving those who have so much to bring to this process. And we heard from these case studies and the colleagues and the organization who are supporting the process that how TAs have been actually successful, really, in the implementation. However, there are still challenges and barriers really going forward, particularly with regard to building capacity and allowing the countries to have the capacity before, during, and after the development and implementation of TNAs, but also the issue of coordination between the different focal points involved in the process is absolutely key. So it's not confusing to the countries either, who's doing what and who needs to work on what. So if there is coordination on that would be very effective, obviously, and will help TNAs become even more successful. And it was encouraging to hear about the content of TNAs and the wide spectrum of activities and the sectors of the economies that they cover. I think that's something that's really great in terms of meeting this objective of enabling developing countries to have access to technology and to have South-South cooperation between the countries as well. And the last point is with regard to the linkages between the TAs and the NDCs. So obviously for the TAs to be even more impactful and more meaningful for the implementation of the Paris Agreement, linking those to the NDCs, which are central to the implementation of Paris Agreement, is critical. I would also add the linkages with the NAPs as well, the National Adaptation Plan. So it's not only the NDCs, but we heard so many countries really giving so much importance in their TNAs to adaptation. So NAPs are also really important vehicles to link the TNAs to. So thank you again to the speakers and the panelists and to everyone who has been following us on this. And I would like to finish by thanking the team who's behind the organization of this event, particularly Bert, Vladimir and Stefan, and the whole team behind the curtains. Thank you very much for that, and thanks to everyone. And I wish you a good afternoon or evening, depending where you are. I know some of you joined us very early. So thank you again for the event, and good luck. Bye.